Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Already Listening, How Sports Can Amplify What Gen Z Cares About, hosted by the Sports and Entertainment Impact Collective in partnership with Parity and Perry Undem. I am Alicia Greenberg, co-founder of the Sports and Entertainment Impact Collective, SEIC, and a longtime connector at the intersection of sports, entertainment, and social impact. I will be the moderator today. SEIC is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. As a grantee of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, RWJF, a leading national philanthropy dedicated to health equity, we are partnering with the foundation on amplifying health equity narratives through sports. That work brought us to this moment, bringing together RWJF research conducted by Perry Undem and independent research from Parity to offer a roadmap for connecting with Gen Z in ways that feel authentic and meaningful. And joining our researchers today is Emma Schieck, two-time Paralympic gold medalist and reigning World Cup gold medalist and MVP, and a member of Gen Z, here to bring her voice to the conversation. Before we hear from our speakers, I want to go over a few quick items. This session is being recorded, and a recording will be shared on the SEIC website within the next few days. The conversation today is organized around 4 themes that came directly from what you told us you wanted to learn about when you signed up for this webinar. And thank you for your responses. Those themes are what Gen Z cares about, how sports shows up in Gen Z lives, how to engage Gen Z, and how Gen Z takes action. Following our discussion, we will open it up to Q&A. Please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A anytime during the session. Let's jump in. I want to start by giving everyone a chance to introduce themselves by telling us who you are and what you're bringing to today's conversation. We'll start with you, Emma.
Awesome. Great. Thank you for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma. I'm a professional athlete. I've been with the U.S. Women's National Sitting Volleyball Team for a long, long time. I started with the team when I was 16 years old and have really gotten to grow up in the world of sport. Bringing to this conversation today, I'm also a really proud member of Gen Z. I'm 24 years old, born in 2001, and have, being on that tail end of Gen Z, but I think I made the cut by a few years still. And getting to see the way that our generation has really uniquely interacted with sport and politics and all sorts of things. So, yeah, excited to hang out with y'all today.
Thanks, Emma. Risa?
Hi, everyone. I'm Risa Isard. I'm the Director of Research and Insights for Parity, a women's sports consultancy focused on professional women athlete partnerships. We work with athletes and brands to foster meaningful relationships that elevate women's sports. We also conduct research to help advance knowledge across the entire ecosystem, as we did with our Gen Z research package, which shout out to Emma who helped make it Gen Z, or maybe I should say it's giving Gen Z. If you thought it was cute, it's because Emma helped me make it cute.
Great. Thanks, Risa. And Kathleen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kathleen Perry, Vice President at Perry Undem. Perry Undem is a small public opinion research firm. We've been working with Alicia and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation over the past few years to conduct research that looks at sports as a mechanism to engage the public on different issues, especially health equity and racism. So I think my background's a little bit different from others here today in that I'm not necessarily coming from a sports background. As a firm, we're mostly focused on health equity and social justice issues. So I'll be bringing that lens into the conversation today. And then a little bit more about the background, or a little bit more background on the research, is that we've done national surveys among adults, and we've done a bunch of focus groups. And this latest research I'll be talking about today is our first focus on teens. So looking at that younger side of Gen Z, those ages 13 to 17. This past January, we did a national survey of teens. So I'm really excited to be here today to share more of our findings from that survey and to learn from everyone else here today as well.
Great. Thank you all. Emma, we're going to dig into some really compelling research, but I want to ask you to start if you could talk about how you've seen sports amplify issues that you and your peers care about.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like first though, I should say I'm coming fresh off of a training camp. I got home Sunday night, and my teammates and I have this tradition. We go to trivia the night before training camp starts, and round one this last week was Gen Z. And so this is also very timely. It was like we got 5 out of 5 questions. So like I'm in the Gen Z headspace right now. But yeah, I think sport in the way that I've engaged with sport. I mean, I've been with the national team since I was 16 years old. It's taken me a lot of places. It's led me to meet a lot of different people. And that makes the world and our country feel very small, right? It makes issues feel more understandable. It's easier to grasp. When I'm playing with people from all different backgrounds, from all different walks of life, and from all over the world. And being able to, one, use the platform the sport has given us to advocate for issues, but two, to connect with people and understand is really cool. And I think a lot of what we see on a more digestible level with sport is a lot about resource allocation, funding, health insurance, and things that impact athletes in a very real way, and can impact performance. So we see a lot of that reflection into what's happening in our bigger society happen in the world of sport too.
That's great. I love that about the trivia. That was great, Emma. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
So we're going to start with the issues themselves. So Kathleen, when you surveyed Gen Z and asked what they care about most, what came back, and did anything surprise you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we knew in the survey that getting a read on, again, we looked at teens, so that younger cohort of Gen Z ages 13 to 17, but getting a good read on teens' top issues was going to be really important for us. So we measured it two different ways in the survey, both an open-ended question where teens could write in any issue they wanted, so we could see what came up organically without any priming. And then we followed that up with a long list of concrete issues that we knew we wanted to get a more specific read on. And we found a lot of overlap in terms of the top issues from those two different approaches, but there are also some key differences too. But in that open end, we asked teens like what issues are most important to them. They were able to type in anything they wanted. And we found homelessness actually really rose to the top there. That was the most frequently cited single word in this exercise. There's also a strong cluster around economic issues, inflation, cost of living, high prices. So taking all those kind of economic themes together, I think economic issues kind of came up as one of the top issues there. There's another cluster around immigration issues, so ICE, deportation, immigration, that came up a bunch. Also around hunger, poverty, food insecurity was another common theme. Racism and bullying were also common responses as well. And I think Meredith is actually putting links in the chat that will take you to little snapshots from our longer report where you can see some of these slides with more detail there too. But we followed that open end up with a more concrete list of issues for teens to respond to, and we found similar issues rose to the top. High cost of living, bullying, mental health issues, racism, those were all kind of top issues in the survey. And then Alicia, you asked what surprised me most in this. So I wasn't really expecting economic issues to be so prevalent in the survey. I don't know about all of you, but when I was 15, I wasn't really worried about inflation. So that kind of surprised me in the survey. But I think in thinking about it more, I think that really started to speak to the role that parents are playing in terms of the issues that teens are paying attention to, how much teens are really listening to their parents. As an opinion research firm, we're doing focus groups night after night. We're always hearing from folks talk about times being tough, just different ways they have to cut back in their budgets, skipping family vacations and stuff like that. So economic issues are a really big focus for family these days. And I think hearing that from teens in our survey really highlighted that as well, just how much they're hearing from and learning from their parents, those different kitchen table kinds of conversations that are translating into the big concerns, the top issues that we see in the survey. The survey also found, parents play a really important role as far as helping teens navigate and process big issues. In the survey, 74% of teens say they trust their parents' voice or advice on big problems more than anyone else's voice. So they're really helping them digest those issues, driving interest, driving concern for what issues they're paying attention to. And then when we compare those, top issues we saw among teens compared to what we saw when we surveyed adults last year, again, there's a lot of consistency in those top issues. Cost of living, mental health, racism, gun violence, those all kind of rose to the top in both. So that's what we're seeing around kind of the top issues that the younger cohort of Gen Z is following right now.
Great. Thanks, Kathleen. Emma, I know the research that Kathleen just talked about really showed that Gen Z responds best when topics are framed as issues impacting a lot of people versus political debates. Does that match your experience? And is there a difference in how you personally think about what you're willing to talk about publicly and how you frame it?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I think what's really important when we're considering something like that is, the context of Gen Z. Like what world did we grow up in? And for me, the first election that I was old enough to vote in was the 2020 presidential election. And I was a college freshman when the pandemic hit. So I grew up in a time where the political world was very polarizing, right? There were a lot of things that were scary that were happening. There was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of arguing, and a lot of political things that were happening at the time, resulted in damaged relationships, friendships, families, and that were torn apart because of how polarizing political debates were. So when you have a group of people that grew up in a time where political debate was so scary, it makes sense, right? That they're nervous about political debate and they're hesitant to speak on issues that can be seen as super polarizing. So when you can frame something as like, yeah, this is an agreeable, we all agree this is something bad, it's a lot less intimidating for a generation that grew up learning the complete opposite, really. And so, I know for me, and a lot of Gen Z, you hear these things, and when you're about to speak on a topic, you wonder, like, all right, is this the thing that cost me my friend, or is this the thing that really drives a wrench in my relationship? And when we can take that fear out because we're framing this as, no, this is good for everyone, that we're going to fix this problem, I think it's a lot more digestible and approachable for Gen Z.
That makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Emma. Risa, I know your report showed that 94% of the athletes in the parity community have at least one cause that they're passionate about and that they want to use their platform to support. Can you share with the group that within that, what causes Gen Z athletes specifically are focused on right now?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Alicia. So first and foremost, Parity, the community of professional women athletes. We have 1,400 to 1,500 pro women athletes in our community. More than 350 of them are themselves members of Gen Z. And when we look at kind of what those Gen Z women athletes tell us they care about, first, I want to highlight that the average Parity Gen Z athlete has nearly 5 causes that they're passionate about. So these aren't single issue people, right? None of us are really single issue people, and we see that is true across our athlete community. The number one cause among Gen Z athletes in the parity community is really a tie between women's issues, which I think makes sense if you think about we're surveying women athletes and what they're seeing in sport, and also mental health, which I know came up a lot in the RWJF survey, right? So it's not surprising that Gen Z athletes are resonating with issues that resonate broadly across Gen Z. And I think it's really exciting to see, I think just that relationship, right? That these athletes are like truly part of their generation. They're not separated from them, even as they have these exceptional experiences. They're best in the world at their sport. They're Olympians and Paralympians. They are World Cup MVPs. They are on national teams. They are missing high school maybe to compete in these events, right? Or they're in their early 20s and they're navigating college. Like they're having really unique experiences, but in what they care about, they're kind of just like other Gen Zers, which I think makes them really relatable and trustworthy. Also want to highlight to close out kind of the top issues that we heard after women's issues and mental health, which were really tied for first. We heard a lot around Black history and issues, again, right, also key on that RWJF research or the research, Kathleen, that you're speaking to, right, around anti-racism and racial equity issues, as well as our Gen Z athletes also care a lot about cancer awareness, earth and sustainability issues, pets, animals, and wildlife. So yeah, like I said, right, we have 350 plus Gen Z athletes. The majority of them are passionate about a number of topics. And in many ways, those topics resonate kind of across their generation.
Great. Thanks so much, Risa. And now that we've looked a little bit at what Gen Z cares about, we're going to move on to talk about how sports shows up in Gen Z lives. Kathleen, I know the research showed that sports are deeply embedded in Gen Z life. In fact, the data shows a majority are actively playing, not just watching, in the real world and the virtual world. Can you talk more about this?
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So our survey found like sports are really deeply embedded in, again, we're looking at teens ages 13 to 17 mostly. So sports are very deeply embedded in their lives, much more so than our research found among adults. Like they tend to be connected to sports in multiple ways, like compared to how compared to how adults tend to be connected to sports. Our survey found 70% of teens say that sports are important to them. 82% say that sports play some sort of role in their lives, and they're engaging with sports in lots of different ways. They're playing sports. 6 in 10 teens are current athletes themselves. They're following professional sports, college level sports. I think 78% said that they're fans of at least one sports league or team. Half say that they regularly attend live sporting events. And then beyond sports in the real world, teens are also often engaging with sports in the digital space. So we asked a lot about video games in the survey too, and we found that a third of teens are regularly following athletes online on social media. A third are playing sports video games regularly themselves. They're deeply connected to gaming communities online, watching video game streamers, following gaming influencers on social media, following esports. So when it comes to reaching teens through sports, our research finds there's lots of opportunity both in partnering with professional sports, but then also in that digital space, like working through video games. They're highly engaged in both these spaces, but they're also likely to say or to see sports and video games as a good place to learn about new issues. And then another point kind of around the role of coaches. I talked a little bit about the influence of parents, but our research really highlighted the important role that coaches play among young athletes as a trusted voice and someone they look up to for advice, and to help them kind of process these big issues we were just talking about. So about 61% of teens say that they're actively playing sports themselves. Among those playing sports, 8 in 10 say that they've had a coach that made a positive impact in their lives. And we asked teens a follow-up to that, asking them to describe what that positive impact was. And again, I think Meredith is putting links in the chat that will give some visuals to this too. But some quotes from that are teens share that coaches made a big difference for them by believing in them when no one else did, helping them find their confidence, teaching them discipline, inspiring them to work harder, making them feel heard, feel important, teaching them to be a good leader. So they really saw their coach as someone that could inspire them to see the impact they can have as individuals, giving them the confidence to speak up for themselves, be part of a team. So when we think about, how sports can help teens learn about and digest these kind of big issues in American society, I think coaches are certainly already playing a really important role here. And then in terms of like helping teens see themselves as part of something larger than themselves, we see coaches especially playing a huge role there.
Great. Thanks so much, Kathleen. Emma, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about some of the things Kathleen just shared. We could start with video games. Do you play video games? And have you seen firsthand how games can incorporate storylines about important issues?
Yeah, great question. So I honestly I don't spend much time sitting still, but when I do have time to sit down, I do play some video games. My teammates and I are big fans of Overcooked. If any of you have played, I've played Minecraft and Madden a few times in my day. And I think that what's really important when we think about video games and how they reflect bigger issues and storylines that are playing out in the real world. And I think Kathleen said it, it's about, teens learning, right? At the end of the day, a lot of these issues in our world we're working towards solving or talking through what we think a solution should be. And at the end of the day, what's so important is that teens learn how to learn. They learn how to problem solve. They learn how to be creative, how to communicate. And I think with, Overcooked, the game that I had mentioned, like that's something where my teammates and I like to play. It's a lot of, move fast, be efficient. How do we do this? What can we do to fix it? And communicating and doing it in real time. And that's really important as they enter the world and learn about new problems that they have to use that skill set to navigate. And when you talk about a game like Minecraft, I mean, that's, how are you interacting with your environment? What are you doing to sustain yourselves? What are you doing to help others? How does a community come together? And to do that in a really creative and safe space that lets you learn, I think is really cool. And it's been, gamified and made into something fun that I think provides teens with an opportunity to learn safely, so that they're ready to tackle these problems and storylines in the real world when they get there.
Great. I don't know about Overcooked. I'm gonna look it up.
It's fun. It's like if anyone out there listening has ever played like Papa's Pizzeria, Papa's Freezeria, I'm showing my Gen Z like really hard right now, but it's like that, but collaborative and like pretty fast. It's kind of intense. So like take a deep breath before you do it, but play.
Don't play it before bedtime.
Yeah, no, it's competitive, but like that's the professional athlete in me. Like I want to compete, so it's fun.
That's great. I will ask my Gen Z son, and I'm sure he will he will tell me about it.
Yeah.
The second thing I wanted to ask you about, Emma, that Kathleen brought up was the role of coaches.
Mhm.
Can you talk about a time a coach has had a positive impact on your life?
Yeah, I think, and like when I talk about coaches that have positively impacted me, it's honestly sometimes it's hard not to get emotional because I've had some really incredible men and women in my life in coaching roles that have had such a strong impact. I guess a little bit of more background on me. I am a Paralympian. I'm a two-time Paralympic Gold Medalist, which means that I also have a physical disability. My disability is called a brachial plex injury and impacts my left arm. So my left arm, you can kind of see it. It doesn't straighten or rotate all the way. It's a little bit smaller. And I've had it my entire life. It's a birth injury. And so I grew up playing soccer. And I remember when I wanted to try volleyball for the first time, and my mom and my dad were really worried because of my little arm, and they didn't know if I would be able to be successful as a volleyball player. And my new school I was going to was like hosting this sport try it day. And the deal that I had made with my mom was that I could go to volleyball and I could try volleyball if I also tried cheerleading. Because she felt like maybe I would love that and I'd want to go that way and not dive into a sport that may make it hard for me to succeed in the future. And I remember walking into the volleyball session and the coach, her name was Linda Crescetti, literally grabbed me by the arm. I was like, no, we're doing this. Come on. My mom was like, okay, she's got a little arm. Like, I don't know. And Linda was like, no, no, she's fine. We're going to figure it out. And that was my first volleyball coach. I fell in love with volleyball. I've not stopped playing ever since. I'm quite a rule follower actually. And I had the cheerleading session after, and this is probably like the first rule I remember breaking in my childhood. I snuck out of the cheerleading session, went out the back and went back to the volleyball gym because I knew that that's where I was supposed to be. And Linda had created a space where, just not even despite my disability, like my disability wasn't even a factor here. It was like, you're a kid, you love this sport, we're going to help you in this sport, and we're going to figure it out and do it together. And I think that's really framed a lot of how I approach life too. Like now, yeah, it might suck, it might be hard, it might be different, but we're going to do it and we're going to figure it out. And I played with Linda for the first several years of my volleyball career. She passed away, I think, on year 3 or 4. But when I think of who I am as an athlete now, an athlete today, the attitude that Linda instilled in me is still so big, and it's something that I hold so close to my heart.
So much for sharing that, Emma. I love that story. We're going to shift and talk a little bit about how to engage Gen Z. And Risa, I want to start with you. Gen Z is twice as likely as other generations to strongly agree that they feel proud supporting a brand that invests in women's sports. For organizations trying to build a genuine connection with this generation, what does that tell us about where to start?
Yeah, I mean, at Parity, our answer to where to start is basically always athletes, right? They are the center of who fans are cheering for and the storylines and that personal connection. And going back to, my opening comment around the way that we see issues playing a role in the lives of Gen Z pro women athletes and where those mirror, the issues that other Gen Zers also care about. I think just really hones in on how relatable Gen Z athletes are. And so it's not surprising to us then that at Parity, our research shows that Gen Z's trust in women athletes is that much greater. And I think this is also right. I appreciate that Emma started with this context of like, what has Gen Z grown up around? At Parity, we like to say that Gen Z is the women's sports generation, like capital TWSNG. And why do we say that? Maybe you don't keep a timeline of women's sports history in your head like I do. So it's really simple. Gen Z was born between the years of 1997 and 2012, right? What are those years in women's sports? 1997 is the summer the WNBA tipped off. 2012 is the summer or is the fall that the NWSL announced that it was going to be relaunching, and then they started play in 2013. So for Gen Z, women's sports are normal, not novel. And I think that shapes everything about how Gen Z relates to women's sports and why we see them kind of with these higher propensities than other generations to be invested in these storylines and to connect to it. So half of Gen Z say that they believe in the products women athletes promote. That's the highest of any generation. They also demonstrate the strongest awareness of women's sports sponsors across most major brand categories, right? That's why we've called this Gen Z is already listening. They're already paying attention. They know who's in women's sports. That normalcy and familiarity with brands with women's sports, with women athletes, also shapes kind of how they're evaluating all of that, especially brands that are partnering with women athletes and making investments in women's sports. So Gen Z is 25% more likely than other generations to trust a brand because of its investment in women's sports. 62% more likely to strongly agree that sponsorship signals a brand is progressive and forward thinking. And they are twice as likely to strongly agree that it makes them proud to support that brand. And I want to pause on that because, like, if you're a brand, right, what you want to do, yeah, you want people to buy your things, but more than that, you want them to keep buying your things, right? You want to build a relationship with them. And so all of these stats, forget about the numbers. It's not important to remember the exact percentages, right? These are all talking about that relationship building, that trust, that perception, and then pride. Like, I don't know about how many things in your life you're proud to buy or a brand you're proud to put your money in, but brands that are investing in women's sports, Gen Z is twice as is that much more likely to be proud to spend their dollars with those brands. And so it's not just entertainment for this audience, like investing in women's sports, building partnerships with women athletes, their value signals, and they're that kind of first line for a brand to get in front of this really compelling audience. Gen Z is on track to become the richest generation in history. Trillions and trillions of dollars by 2030, right? So like really, really meaningful opportunities for brands to understand Gen Z as consumers if they build those meaningful relationships and, do that in large part through women's sports.
Great. Thanks, Risa. I couldn't agree more about like when you show or visually I picture a timeline that you walked us through a little bit. And I know for me, I personally had the chance to work on the Women's World Cup. It was one of my first 99 Women's World Cup and one of my first roles in sports. And I know firsthand that how important that event was in that moment, in that timeline, especially for Gen Z. So thank you for sharing that. Emma, I want to talk a little bit about the data which shows that Gen Z is open to hearing about issues on social media, in addition to before or after a game. Those seem to be really great moments to engage with this generation. Can you talk about where and when you're most comfortable talking about things that matter to you, and when are you personally paying attention most to issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it changes a little bit too, depending on, how am I at this game, right? Because when I'm at a game as an athlete competing, my focus is being an athlete and competing, especially at the level that I'm playing at. When I'm at a game as a spectator, I think it's a very different world. When we're talking about hitting Gen Z with issues, or really any group of people with issues, I think it's really important to meet them where they're at. And for Gen Z, I mean, Risa just said it, they're at women's sporting events, right? They're at sporting events and they're also on social media. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense that they are open to, or in some cases expecting to hear about issues in those places. And there's a lot of value in hitting them there. I also don't think it's quite enough. I assume that everyone in this call and everyone in Gen Z has friends who think differently than them in one or two ways at least, right? And I think there's a lot of value in where I'm most comfortable talking about issues, even with people I disagree with, or the people that I know, and I think there's a lot of work that we can do in connecting, communicating, working together to tackle an issue, much like we talk about with Overcooked and how we do things there. I think that's how we interact with people too. And growing up, like I had mentioned earlier, during a time that was very polarizing and very political, Gen Z and myself had to learn how to have those conversations, even when they're difficult, and to make them comfortable, or at the bare minimum, be comfortable being uncomfortable. And so I find myself, talking to teammates, talking to friends, talking to my parents or my parents' friends who don't always agree with me, but will hear me out. And I can, at the minimum, bring my experience and the life that I've lived to help them see another side of issues, or figure out where do we go from here. If we can't be on the same page, to at least work towards the same goal, right?
Great. Thanks, Emma. The last section we're going to discuss before opening it up for questions, and just a reminder, you can throw your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them at the end. We're going to talk about what drives Gen Z to action. This is the question our audience most wanted to hear the answer to. What actually moves Gen Z from paying attention to doing something? Kathleen, the research shows 77% of Gen Z who noticed anti-racism efforts in sports took action as a result. What kind of actions did they take and what created that momentum?
Yeah. So our research showed that both looking at adults and looking at teens, so the full spectrum of Gen Z here, it found that sports fans are paying really close attention. They're noticing these kinds of conversations around big social issues already happening in sports. Emma, you did a great job, kind of like showing kind of how those conversations are happening and being driven by things that they're already seeing happen in sports and connecting with other fans. And we tested some of those ideas in the survey with teens as well. Again, I think there's going to be links in the chat with some visuals. But we asked respondents whether they recall seeing past anti-racism efforts in sports, things like end racism end zones in the NFL, Breonna Taylor stickers on helmets, a few other things like that. The survey found 7 in 10 teens remember seeing these kinds of efforts in sports. Most also expressed their support for efforts like these in sports. And then we also see in the data that these efforts also seem to be leading to real action among teens as well. Like you mentioned, Alicia, the survey found 77% of teens who had had recalled seeing some sort of anti-racism effort in sport took action as a direct result of that. They were most likely to say that they talked with a parent or a family member, that they thought about the issue more, did their own research, or talked to a friend about it. So we see that teens are really being inspired by these little efforts, these little initiatives to have conversations, educate themselves on these big ideas. And while, having a conversation with someone might not always seem like the most significant action to take, I think, public opinion research, a lot of our own studies too, have shown have kind of consistently found the power in that conversation, as a critical space for people to learn from one another, process views together, kind of resolve uncertainties, and then ultimately change opinion or influence behaviors. So we see that in this survey with teens, we see that in our survey of adults with the same thing, that when we look at those who have taken some kind of action, so primarily those who have had conversations with others, those respondents tend to look a little bit different than those who have not taken an action. They tend to be like further along in their views. They're more likely to express strong support, strong opinions. They're more steadfast advocates for sports addressing big issues in American society. They're more likely to strongly support athletes sharing their stories, which Parity's research also found, starting with athletes really is a what drives Gen Z to action, and we really see that here too, where. And then in our survey of adults, we conducted a more kind of in-depth analysis where we were able to control for different demographics like political party, racial identity, education, and we still found that direct link between exposure to anti-racism efforts, likelihood to take an action, and then that leading to increased support for athletes in sports speaking out on important issues. So it's pretty cool in our research to be able to draw that direct link between seeing something, even something that might seem as small as an athlete wearing a t-shirt with a slogan, but that really makes a difference. And that leads to a conversation, leads to education, and then ultimately attitudinal change. And then I'll also just say that the research finds, teens are open to hearing lots of messages from lots of different messengers, but a really important factor to moving them to action is that perceived authenticity piece. We see that in our research with adults too, that, sports fans, especially teens, really value an athlete speaking from a place of authenticity. As far as what being authentic means to them, I think it means, showing up with more than just words or more than just being a paid spokesperson, but it's backing up that message or that story with their own actions. It's, volunteering with an organization, showing up to their community, committing their time, or really just being like their real, authentic self.
Thanks, Kathleen. Emma, when something's happening in your community and beyond that bothers you, what action do you take?
Yeah, it's a great question. Kathleen started to mention it too, conversation doesn't always seem like a lot, but it is a first step and it is really important. And so that tends to be where I start. Beyond that, I consider myself to be a really big advocate for women's and adaptive sports. And a lot of the reason is because I'm a pro woman athlete and I play an adaptive sport. And for me in that space, taking action looks a little bit different because it is something that I experience so personally and so personally have friends going through. And the way that I've, shown up in that space has changed a lot over time, right? I've been a professional adaptive athlete for going on 9 years now. And, at this day and in this day and age, it sounds crazy to say, a big way to show up is to show up on social, right? I like to approach this issue from the the viewpoint that in the adaptive sports space, at least, people with disabilities being recognized as people and as athletes, it starts with creating and sharing information and generating awareness. And so showing up on social and sharing what it looks like to be an athlete with a disability and what my sport looks like. Because a lot of people haven't seen sitting volleyball before, and answering questions and, I working really hard to assume that people are approaching me and asking questions not out of ignorance, but out of curiosity without judgment and assume best intent, to just share. I think it's really powerful. And I see success with it when I have girls come from my social media into our national team development program pipeline and to start training and trying these sports and where can I watch the Paralympics and asking all these questions and realizing what people with disabilities can do and are capable of. It makes my heart smile. And then in the women's sports space, getting to be on the team with Parity. I work in brand partnerships with Parity. I guess I didn't mention that earlier on as well. But we, work to create opportunities for pro women athletes and to know that I am able to be in a career that lets me work towards taking action to an issue that bothers me is really powerful as well. And I do love if you haven't seen them, our Let's Pay Women Athletes merch is pretty sick. So I'm not above a t-shirt slogan.
That's great. Well, speaking of parity, Risa, the research shows that Gen Z is more likely than other generations to say the brand's investment in women's sports makes them more likely to buy a brand. How does an organization replicate that type of motivation to act?
Yeah, I love this question, because it's kind of right. Like, okay, what does it mean for brands, but what does it mean for brands and anyone else that's trying to tap into Gen Z and, um, yeah, activate them, and engage them. And so what we see in the data is that Gen Z doesn't respond to women's sports sponsorships when it's like as just a one-off moment, right? It's about signals of consistency and alignment, right? Kathleen mentioned authenticity. So it's how the athletes are authentic, but it's also how the brands or how the organizations are showing up authentically in women's sports. It's not just a flash in the pan moment. It's not just a one-time engagement. It's like truly being part of the women's sports ecosystem. That's what gets Gen Z, consumers, audiences, fans bought into it. So replicating that kind of motivation that we see in sports requires other organizations to think about how they show up in that consistent, authentic way. So treating women's sports, investment in women's sports, right, as that long-term commitment. Gen Z is highly attuned to whether support feels performative or sustained. And so when you see brands or organizations, right, backing athletes and leagues and opportunities consistently, see, that's what builds the credibility and the trust and the pride and the purchase intention. We also know that athlete partnerships matter in a very big way. When brands collaborate with athletes in ways that elevate athletes' stories, platforms, and impact, do not just kind of here's an endorser with only here's a piece of product, right? The relationship feels authentic and motivating. And it really kind of, again, right, helps consumers connect to the athlete, which are people they're already following and stories that people they're already like invested in, to broaden out that relationship. And with that, right, then visibility and storytelling are really critical. So Gen Z is more aware of women's sports sponsors than older generations, which tells us that they're paying attention. They want organizations that amplify their investment through content, through community engagement, through really intentionally helping to close gaps in ecosystems, and helping audiences understand why the partnership exists. All of that helps to strengthen that connection and move audiences to action. So kind of right, the TLDR maybe is ultimately what drives action is alignment and authenticity. When Gen Z sees that a brand is really in women's sports, they interpret it as a signal about values, progress, equity, cultural relevance. And so those are the kinds of commitments that you want to have be visible, have sustained, and have athlete centered, to give you the best chance at engaging that audience and motivating them into action and to loyalty, and so forth.
Great. Thanks, Risa. So we're gonna pause here for some questions. Again, if you have a question and you want to put it in the Q&A, we will try to get to it. I want to start by asking about, from a storytelling perspective, of what interests most for storytelling as far as video versus written for Gen Z. Have you learned anything in the research? Emma, feel free to also share your own personal opinion and experience. But when it comes to storytelling, what resonates most? Again, video, written, something else, like what stands out?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit from our research, where we haven't explicitly tested, written versus video storytelling, but I think just from what the research has shown us around like what we were talking about before of like adding that human element, putting a face on an issue, whether that's, making an athlete's story feel more accessible to the fan, showing, like how they're showing up with their actions more than just like a post on social media. I think that speaks to, the value of like a video piece where possible. I think there's value in both. But I think just for that desire for like human connection, I think it's a little easier to convey that maybe through a video medium. And we also, like what we talked about of just like Gen Z being in social media, they're, on YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, those are very video-based mediums. So it's just going to be a little bit more accessible in order to reach Gen Z if you can convey a story via video. But, I know resources are always limited. You don't always have a videographer crew. So I think, just telling a story like either way, whether it's written or video, as long as it kind of comes from that like authentic piece of like personal experience and all that, like I think that will always resonate.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that a lot of what Kathleen says, I mean, a lot of it makes sense. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about, meeting Gen Z where they're at. And in some cases, that's a sporting event. In a lot of cases, it's on social media. And I would hate to see the average screen time on TikTok for a lot of Gen Z, but that is, they sit and they scroll and they scroll. And if you can, create, I think, short form video and circulate it on those platforms, I think you see a lot of success and it makes sense, because that's where they are for their mindless scroll. And I know, for me, if I'm coming across something in a video format on social media where I already am spending my time, that is what prompts me to then go look for written pieces, So I don't think that they're like mutually exclusive. You can only do one or should only do one, but I think starting in video, for me personally, makes a lot of sense.
I think Kathleen and Emma really knocked it out of the park there.
Great. Thank you. Our next question asks, do you think there are lessons for the social change advocacy space more broadly from the world of sports? I'm thinking particularly of harnessing messages of possibility and positive framing to drive action, shifting from a dominance of anti/ countering messages while still pushing for accountability.
Absolutely. Yes, yes, for sure. I think that sports in a lot of ways, metaphorically speak about the world that we live in. And I highly, highly, highly recommend. My team book clubbed it in 2020, back when we weren't able to get together and train. We read Wolfpack by Abby Wambach together. If you haven't read it, it is an incredible read. It's a short book. It's an easy read. And she kind of breaks down a lot of, being on the women's soccer team and what advocating for change looks like there, and, how we frame messaging. And the one that I always, that sticks out to me is, be grateful for what you have, but demand what you deserve. And I think when we're in the advocacy space, like that's important, right? Like understand, like, yes, I, as a pro woman athlete with a disability, am really thankful for the opportunity to get paid to travel the world with my best friends to do the sport that I love. But also, that doesn't mean the space is perfect. And there are things we can continue to advocate for and push for. And that, extends beyond the world of sport really well. So shout out Wolfpack. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend. But yeah, absolutely.
I'll chime in and say I think, I appreciate this question, right? Are there lessons for the social change advocacy space more broadly from the world of sports? And when I think about women's sports is all about envisioning what's possible, but isn't currently provided for. Right? The WNBA launched in 1997. There were some other pro women's basketball leagues before then, so I don't want to erase them. But it's notable that the WNBA is the longest lasting team sport pro league for women in this country's history. And that comes about because people dream of what's possible and they invest resources in making it so. And then they do that for 30 years until we get to the CBA that just got signed. And so when I think about social change, I think it's that. It's bringing together believers and dreamers and people who aren't afraid to push the status quo and who are going to roll up their sleeves and they're going to bring other people along with them, and they're going to build, really creative partnerships, and on and on. And so I think women's sports is a testament to kind of social change that's possible. Over the years, right? Women's sports became more normalized. It has more cultural cachet than it has ever had. We still, to Emma's point, right? Like, let's celebrate that and let's keep going, because there's a lot more work to be done. Not every league is a WNBA. Not every woman athlete just signed a CBA like that. Um, so for me, that's the lesson I think from sport for social change is, it's, what happens when you bring people together to, who don't take no and who keep pushing uphill. And then, you get to a moment to celebrate, and then you keep pushing some more.
Yeah, I'll just speak quickly to the piece on like the positive framing aspect and messaging of like, rather than the anti or counter messaging, but just that positive forward-looking framing is something that we're seeing in a lot of our messaging work right now, of just like that's really what people want to hear. And I think that's especially like within sports, I think sports is like such a place of like a unifying space for fans of, whatever walk of life can come together in their fandom, like thinking of like the sport fan kind of perspective, their fandom of that league or of that team kind of bridges all the different divides. And we've heard that kind of throughout this research of just like, you can vote for whoever, you can believe whatever off the field, but you come together and you kind of root together for the same team. So I think sports can be that unifying place, that place of common ground. And I think, having that positive forward-looking framing is just like, it's just like that combination together is really what would resonate.
Right.
Next question talks about youth sports a little more. Research shows the middle school, high school years typically see dropout rates of youth engaging with structured sports. Is there research data or stories in the work you all have been doing and that you shared that reflects which issues might contribute to this statistic?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's an important question. And I can only speak like anecdotally about like the stories that I've seen and experienced. But when we talk about dropout rates and the reason that people aren't staying in sport at a young age, I encourage all of us to remember like how hard it is to be 13 years old, right? Like how hard it was to be 13 years old. And now today we've added social media and all these expectations that are, I feel like you're drowning when you're that young. And when you enter sport into that equation, especially if you get a competitive kid, right? Like it's a lot of it feels like the end of the world and it feels so important. And as an athlete who struggled with sport when I was younger, I got cut from my 7th grade team and my 9th grade team, and made the teams in between. Like it's tough, right? When you're already struggling with confidence and figuring out who you are and how you exist in this world and adding on like the pressure of competition and am I good enough for this? Am I not going to make this team because so and so is better than me? It's really challenging. And add social media and see how everyone else is doing. If you're Gen Z at all, or if you're just a Noah Kahn fan, he just put out an album last week, and he talked about everyone looks so happy in a photograph, right? It's so true, and we've added that into the world of sport, which is already so challenging. And I hope that like when we approach things like this, we remember this context. I'm sure there's so much research to talk on it as well, but it makes a lot of sense when we see the world we've created with it.
Yeah, I can chime in here too. Everything Emma said, cosign. There's not one simple answer to why kids drop out of sports, right? So first of all, kids change their interests all the time. So like maybe a portion of it. It is certainly not the main culprit, I would hypothesize. But I do think it's also just like worth noting that there's a lot of reasons why kids change their minds about what's fun, and Emma just talked about it. But it's also like, well, what's fun? And youth sports are no longer fun for many kids, right? There's a lot of pressure around them. They're also not affordable for many kids and families. If we're thinking about girls, there are unique barriers and issues that girls face around puberty and changing bodies, that can make playing sports, which are a highly physically embodied experience, really uncomfortable, and really awkward and really discouraging. There is pressure from parents, there's pressure from coaches. There are coaches who are really well-meaning, but they're not trained in the right mechanisms. The voice of kids are largely not in embedded in youth sports most of the time anymore. Like what is actually fun to them is not actually what youth sport is designed around. Um, on and on and on. And so, I think there's a lot of data actually around what is standing in the way of kids participating in sports. And I also think here, right, as we talk about differences for, and highlight like what's positive and possible in women's sports, we should also really pay attention to what are the unique experiences of girls in sports. And lastly, on that, I would say, right, women's sports has the most cultural cachet that they've ever had. Right, they still get a fraction of the media coverage. They still get a fraction of the investment dollars, and all of that. Those are also societal values and signals about what's valued and what matters, right? And so we can talk about these kind of like structural issues that are affecting youth sports, and all of them are true. But we also have to ask, like, what are society's messages about what matters for sports? And I would say that girls are being told today more than ever that their sports matter, but they're still often implicitly told that their sports matter less than boys' sports do. And so I think we have to sit with that, which is a bit uncomfortable. And I also think it paints a picture for like the roadmap still to go and what we can all work together on achieving. And how the investment that's happening in women's sports today is so important for brands and so important for the athletes and so important for society too. It's really a win-win-win opportunity here.
So you like 100% agree with them everything shared, especially like the affordability piece. Just thinking of about like the issues shared in the survey of like just like cost of living being such a high issue, just like the trade-offs some families are having to make to like decide how to allocate their budget and to what extent that might be maybe extracurriculars or sports or is what might have to make the cut. And so just the support for families to be able to continue putting their kids into sports and just what they need in that space is, I think, really important.
Yeah. The next question asks, is any suggestions for how to get fans of men's sports to be as open and organized on social issues and policies as what we've seen in women's sports? There's such a gap between the two, and I'd love to see men's sports follow women's sports here.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to our research in that, we've looked across fandom of like different leagues, and we certainly see fans of women's sports tend to be a little bit further ahead in terms of like openness and like wanting to hear stories from athletes and all that. But I think that those fans also exist in men's sports. There's a lot of overlap, in fandom where, many people are following different sports. As far as how to get them more, engaged, I would love to hear if my other panelists have ideas, but those fans do exist too. Like they're prevalent in like every league. But yeah, there certainly is a higher concentration that we see among women's sports fans.
Yeah, I think that a lot of what matters, and we're to answer this question, we have to understand, why is this happening in women's sports, right? In order to get it to happen in men's sports and make changes to make it happen in men's sports, we have to understand how we got here on the women's sports side. And I think that, for better or for worse, we started with a lot of talking about things that were happening off the court or off the field of play in pro women athletes' lives, and not focusing on them as an athlete, which I'm all for like treating athletes like athletes, but what that started was this domino effect where we really started to care about the human side of the athlete, right? Human first, athlete second. And then brands started to catch on to that and started to tap into the human side of the athletes and the storytelling and the brand partnerships. And people, I mean, like myself and so much of Gen Z, you find the Ilona Mars of the world, right? Where they kind of have this really, fascinating way of engaging with their fans outside of their sport. And that makes you care about them and care about what they have to say and care about their commentary on social issues and policies. So in men's sports, we've really kind of, kept athletes as athletes, and we haven't, I don't think, invested in the same way to them personally and as humans. And so when we're looking, I think, to grow that in the men's games, a lot of it starts about, caring about them as people and encouraging brands to do the same and encouraging the athletes to show up in a way that engages with their fans as humans. But I also, as a pro women athlete, I love seeing the women's sports space do such a great job at this.
I think Kathleen and Emma nailed it.
Well, our last few minutes here, I was hoping each of you maybe 30 to 60 seconds could just talk about, of all the things we've gone over, what you most want people to actually remember and do something with after they leave. And we'll start with you, Kathleen.
Yeah, I think the thing that's like stood out to me most throughout the many iterations of our research that we've done so far is just the extent to which like seemingly small interventions can really make such a big difference. Like an athlete wearing a t-shirt, a video game, holding an in-game protest, just like little moments like that, where our research has just shown time and time again that there's a high level of recall. People, they notice those things, they're paying attention, they remember them, and then they're taking action as a result. We know those conversations are happening. We know they're being inspired to educate themselves, educate others. And I think, this whole research project we've been doing is kind of about that long-term narrative change. And I think that's like such a critical piece to bring about that longer-term narrative change, is to inspire those conversations. And I think being able to see that, direct link in the data has been given me a lot of validation, and I hope can be inspiring to all of those, on the call today who maybe are working in positions where they can keep doing that kind of good work and keep creating those little moments in sports, because we find that that really can lead to, legitimate real change.
Great. Risa?
Yeah. So I love that when Parity put out our research on Gen Z as an audience, and how do we said, like, how do you slay your ROI by using women's sports to reach Gen Z? Thanks, Emma, for making sure that that was like not a cringe. I think you told me it was like cool cringe to say, so I was like, okay, I can get down with that. But as part of that, we actually came up with a whole decision tree, like what should you do, right? Because there isn't actually one answer to what a brand or an organization should do, or how do you show up in women's sports. It really does start with, well, what are you trying to achieve? And so based on that, right, what should you do? And so I really want to encourage people to download Parity's Pocket Marketing Guide about Gen Z. You can get it at paritynow.com/Gen Z. And it's going to cover all the stats we talked about today, but it's also going to have a decision tree for you that asks you, like, what are you trying to achieve? And so therefore, what are kind of our recommendations based in the data about how you can activate in women's sports? A little bit of a spoiler, right? Like, awesome to engage an athlete as a long-term ambassador to get at some of the things we talked about, that authenticity and that consistency, and kind of, right, that showing up time and time again, showcasing them in cause-driven campaigns. We know that 94% of athletes in the Parity community have at least one cause that they're passionate about. The Gen Z athletes have an average of 5. And so these are athletes who, right, to the point of like, Gen Z teens want to see, spokespeople who are authentically committed and are, on their own passionate. Like, the Parity community is full of athlete ambassadors who are authentically committed to a variety of different causes. And so we'd love to partner with you on finding that right fit for your organization. That's what we do all day, every day. And whether it is for a product launch or it is for an advocacy campaign, Parity's here to be your teammate.
Great. Thanks, Risa. And Emma, I'm curious if you could close with what you hope the future looks like for sports as a platform for storytelling and amplifying important issues.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the future is bright. I know me personally, I hope to leave the world of sport a better place than I found it. And I think there are so many athletes with an aligned mindset on that. And I really would encourage everyone, give Gen Z, especially your Gen Z pro athletes, a chance, right? Give them a chance, give them space, because they have grown up in a really unprecedented transformational time. One, with the growth of women's sports, but two, the political landscape we live in, the changing presence of social media and how that's played a role. We're growing up as a very resilient and uniquely experienced group that I really hope in the future we give those people space to make positive change and to share those unique experiences and to really lean on them, because I think it's something that can hold a lot of power if we let it, especially to amplify the issues that we're experiencing.
Great. Well, thank you, Kathleen, Risa, and Emma. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you so much for being our speakers today. I also want to thank my SEIC co-director, Mary Wolf, and everyone else who made this possible, including Britt, Krista, Mike, Katie, and Scott. As I mentioned earlier, a recording will be available on the SEIC website shortly. You can also find a link to the research on that same website. So be sure to go there for the recording and for more on the research. And you will be receiving an email with a short survey about the session that's also being linked in the chat. We'd love your feedback on today, and be sure to connect with SEIC to stay in the loop on future conversations like this. And thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank
Thanks,
you guys.
everyone.
Thanks for hanging out.